Welcome, Professor Pano Yanakoyogos from the New York University. And today we're going to talk a little bit about the news which we've seen I think it was a week ago, that Russian hackers were attempting to steal research related to COVID-19. And I'll just start with the first questions. Is it proven that the Russians were actually behind that attack?
Yeah, Patrick, thanks for having me, first of all. And I think the evidence that the United Kingdom provided with regards to the Russian hackers involved in the COVID research, it's pretty comprehensive. They provide not only the units within the Russian military that they believe are behind, but also the technical infrastructure that they use, including malware or that code that they use to gain access to computer systems that was very specific to the organization. So I think all the technical indicators are there. It's not surprising that this is happening. What is surprising is the fact that there has been made a political decision on the part of the United States and the United Kingdom to now come out and publish this evidence in order to hold the Russians to some sort of accountability for their actions.
Yeah, I remember back in May there was a note from the UK and US, Homeland Security. Not that the name in the UK, but they published a joint note that there are increasing attacks on COVID-19 research. But back then they didn't point fingers to one of the states. Why do you think they did that now?
It's a way to signal to Russia that, hey, we know what you're doing. We know very well what you're doing. So it has really three things. One is just geopolitical finger pointing, naming and shaming. So countries love to name and shame. So when you can and you reach a political decision to do so, you do it. The second is kind of helping private companies that might be involved with COVID research to kind of raise their own threat posture. So the technical indicators that are included in these attribution documents are intended not only to show the Russians that we know what they're using, but really to give the IP address ranges to the private sector so that they can start tuning their firewalls and getting all their intrusion detection mechanisms in place to help block any more use of that infrastructure. So then what that does on the Russian side, and this is the third point, is that it increases the cost for them because now they can no longer use that infrastructure to hack companies. It's increased that those IP domain name ranges and other command and control infrastructure can't be used if companies are going out and out blocking those ranges. So they have to go out and rebuild that infrastructure, which takes time and money and personnel talent that might be diverted from other projects that the Russians are doing. So I think that's the real effect. There is obviously a lot of dialogue about how, hey, if you just point a finger at someone, nothing really is going to happen. But it's at the technical level where I think the most damage is being done because of the uprooting of the infrastructure that requires the adversary to go out and rebuild.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. But isn't it possible, how difficult is to rule out that that was in fact a attack from another country, and they just sort of hidden the attack and pretending it was actually originated from Russia?
Yeah, so that's definitely happened. In one case, the United States and the United Kingdom were convinced that Iranians were hacking certain targets. And then after about a 6 to 9 month investigation, they really realized that Russians had hijacked Iranian tools and they were the ones really behind those sorts of attacks. So it's definitely a concern. However, in this case in particular, they're using indicators of compromise and tools, tradecraft, and malware being used are all things that are within the Russian modus operandi. So nothing is ever 100%, but I think that the level of confidence in the fact that Russians were the ones targeting the specific vaccine research is high enough to have the US and UK governments come out and publicly attribute the activity to the Russians. Having learned from their seeing the Russians hijacking Iranian tool sets, and that would only increase the rigor of the level of analysis that goes into unpacking who's doing what to whom in this case.
Okay. So why do you think, I mean, obviously the whole world these days is interested in some sort of cure of that kind for COVID-19. But why the Russians? Wouldn't China be a more probable source for these kinds of attacks?
Oh, certainly. And China actually, 2 Chinese hackers were indicted by the Department of Justice here in the US last week for targeting companies that were involved in COVID research. So in that case, the Chinese hackers have been operating since around 2009, not targeting just pharmaceutical companies, but basically the entire intellectual property of US corporations. But the indictment that was unsealed last week specifically points to them having also been involved in hacking COVID research. So this is just what's been unsealed. I'm sure what has been unsealed or still remains behind closed doors. There's a much more likelihood that Chinese are a lot more active in going after COVID research data, especially because it is such a matter of national pride for the Chinese Communist Party to develop a vaccine first, to kind of show the advancement of Chinese science and kind of within the Made in China 2025 industrial policy that they have. So I think that the Chinese are probably at it a lot more, but now we just have 2 cases of public attribution where Russia and China have been specifically marked out for hacking data related to coronavirus vaccine research.
Okay, but isn't that in terms of actually finding something against COVID-19, isn't that counterproductive? Shouldn't the Chinese, the Russians, the US, UK, and basically the whole world actually work together?
Absolutely. I mean, it makes intuitive sense that if you're facing a global pandemic and it spreads across borders, then the scientific communities around the world should bring their collective minds using all this great remote working information technology to bring the best and the brightest to bear on the problem. However, money complicates things and geopolitics complicates things, right? So money, the pharmaceutical companies who get there first know there's billions of dollars at stake. Therefore, there might be a chilling effect on them sharing research that they're having, any success that they're having. So the UK, the US governments, all the nation states with a lot of financial resources have already said we're going to give the companies billions of dollars if the vaccine trials go ahead and you create a viable vaccine. So there's the profit motive on the corporate side. Then on the geopolitical side, we are unfortunately at a place right now where the great powers, Russia, China, and the United States, don't really have really great relationships. So there's a disincentive there for true cooperation. It's not just in COVID research, it's other things that humanity should be getting together to work towards, like space travel, where we've seen cooperation in those fields as well, just kind of falling apart as a result of geopolitical rivalries that are re-emerging at the current moment in time.
Yeah, you mentioned geopolitics are not at its best, to phrase it that way. What effect does that have on cyber security and also cyber intelligence specifically? Not only looking at the Chinese and the Russians, but also looking at what we're in the Western world are basically doing and pursuing.
Yeah. So when it comes to cyber intelligence, the former director of the CIA, Michael Hayden, once said that all countries spy on each other. They've been spying on each other since biblical times, since the Iliad and the Odyssey. Intelligence operations are just one way that countries gain information to help them make better political decisions, help them manage their relationships with other countries. And it's always been this hidden dimension of international politics. Where cyber comes into play is that it becomes a lot easier to access information that's not just national security information, that is also corporate intellectual property. And this is where it becomes really tricky because some countries have decided to use their national intelligence apparatuses in order to gain both national security secrets, but also corporate secrets. And then that gives their corporations unfair advantage when intelligence services pass that information along to their corporations within the country. We've seen this with China, basically. Their operations in the early 2000s caused a Canadian company named Nortel to go bankrupt. Secondary and third order consequences are people lose jobs, and the GDP has an impact when major companies start to go bankrupt because a company has been able to get information from an intelligence service to help them make better pricing points, leapfrog research and development, that kind of stuff. So that's the real difference with cyber, is that there's this fluid, in many countries, there's this fluid exchange of information between governments and the private sector to help enable their competitive activity as part of an industrial policy. The US kind of stands out in the world as the one country that has very strict laws and policies and practices that prohibit the CIA, NSA, and other members of the US intelligence community from then going to, say, a US company and saying, hey, we found this secret formula from a competitor of yours in Antarctica. Now you can use it. There's very strict legal prohibitions for that to happen. So we're kind of the outlier in the United States in terms of that. The rest of the world is kind of following a policy of, if the information's there and we can use cyber to get to it much more efficiently than recruiting someone on the inside or tapping a phone and that kind of stuff, then we're going to use cyber because that's going to help us get the competitive advantage. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Just wondering. I think one of the other laws that there is in the US is that you're not allowed to spy on your own citizens. However, you are allowed to spy on foreign citizens. And we had the Schrems II decision about 2 weeks back, that from the European Union side, it's not allowed anymore to store the data. Well, the US is not the only country which is affected there, but definitely, since most of the tech giants are located in the US, how does that come into play?
Yeah, I thought it was very ironic. I'm not a privacy law expert by any means. I'm more on the national security side. But what I found ironic of this privacy wall ruling is that if the Europeans kept and stored all their data in the United States, it would be much better protected because of the protections of data within the United States from surveillance laws than if it's stored in the EU with all these GDPR mechanisms in place to protect the privacy of the data. So I'll unpack that a little bit more. So let's say that there's a European country that does not have a robust law enforcement national security partnership with the United States. And the United States knows that there's nefarious activity going on in that European country. The hard decision there is, do we want to maintain relationships with that country and keep going down the political process of trying to get our law enforcement entities to work together under Europol and the FBI? Or do we just send out our intelligence gathering apparatus to hack the data that we need in order to pursue a terrorist or something like that? And that's where I think it really becomes difficult, because at the end of the day, you have to bend the entire decision on what the United States relationship with that particular European country is and what the effect of some sort of hacking operation would have on the relationship if it were discovered. So That's where I think it becomes complicated with
It's
the new
a
rules.
very, very interesting take on the subject, though, because if I see the media coverage over here in Germany, all they talk about is basically the privacy side of things. So, the NSA being able theoretically to look at my data. But we're not talking about the protection, where you say that actually the protection might be of the data might be a lot better in the US. That's a very interesting take on the subject, as I mentioned. Yeah, absolutely. But going back to more of your topic of research, so cybersecurity and cyber geopolitics. There's a election coming up in the US in November. Do you think the Russians or other countries will try to manipulate that election again? One probably must say.
Absolutely. So it depends on what you mean by manipulation. If it's information operations intended to use social media, well-placed editorials in a newspaper, and that kind of stuff to sway the public opinion towards one candidate or another, I think that will absolutely continue, and we even see it continuing today. Where it becomes more interesting is if they'll actually try to go after the election boxes, so the polling stations where people actually go and cast their votes. So these systems are known to have vulnerabilities in them. It requires a lot of special knowledge to be able to pull off an attack where you actually mess with the tabulation data. But I'd assume that the Russians do have the knowledge, skills, and abilities to pull it off. So the question there is, will their leadership decide to actually cross what the United States has declared as a red line and now go after the polling data? So there's that piece of it actually happening, with just a suggestion that it happened in the wake of a very controversial election here in the United States, where maybe they don't even do it, but they just then use their troll farms and their social media platforms to amplify the message that the elections are illegitimate. So there's a lot of politics there to uncover, especially with a sitting president who has said he doesn't know if he'll accept the results of an election. And that kind of thing might just give the current US president the enough to kind of say, hey, maybe I don't need to step aside. So there's a lot of different ways that this can go. It definitely shows that democracies are fragile, even democracies as robust as the United States. And in order to prevent it, I would hope that US Cyber Command, the military arm of the United States, will be currently doing things as it did before the 2018 elections to start disrupting some of that Russian social media infrastructure to help at least reduce the level of messaging that is hitting the US.
What about the companies themselves? Shouldn't they be better prepared as well?
They should, but I mean, it's hard because their whole business model relies on how many people they have there. I've seen reports of the Russians having gotten better at masking their true identity. So before they would pay in rubles, now they're paying in dollars and that kind of stuff to kind of get past the algorithms. But social media platforms certainly have a duty to ensure that they're not being used as tools against democracy, because they were founded on democratic principles, but now it seems like they're being used to disrupt democracy and cause friction within populations.
Okay. Maybe manipulation of elections or other public events, and cyber intelligence, cyber warfare as well. How do you think all these different topics will evolve in the near and probably the distant future? What will we see there? What can we expect?
I think that we're going to see more of a increase in this kind of activity, especially as smaller states decide that, hey, this is a really cool way for me to be able to compete with my neighbor. So I'll use two examples to kind of amplify what the risks from that are. The first is Stuxnet, and the second is NotPetya. So Stuxnet is an example of a highly sophisticated piece of malware that caused physical damage against its intended target, which was the Iranian nuclear facility. NotPetya was a semi-sophisticated piece of malware that did not get out, and that got out, it caused havoc around the world, even though it was targeted towards a specific uh, software in the Ukraine. So what I fear is that as countries start to increasingly try to use cyber capabilities, they will more than likely create more of a NotPetya global disruptive effect, because they might not have studied a target in depth enough to be able to create those very precision effects that we saw with Stuxnet. And then that only increases the potential for unintentional escalation of conflict. If country A is going after the railroad system in country B, and all of a sudden hospitals in country B and daycares in country B are also being affected, that could cause decision makers to rapidly go from the cyber world to the kinetic field or some other response mechanisms. So I guess long story short is we're going to see an acceleration of the use of cyber. We need to make sure that the great powers are using cyber responsibly, so that that use can be used as a model by other countries that are also going to be exploring these more offensive oriented options.
Now, if I take a look at the history of warfare, so to speak, it was some 100 years ago. It was literally man to man, and then it became more armies against armies. And in the Second World War, I think we started to see that the attacks reached the population with the bombings of cities and stuff. Do you think the future of warfare, including cyber warfare, will be more dangerous to the general population or less dangerous?
So with the Internet of Things integrating digital technology deeper into our homes, our physical homes, and our lives becoming more dependent on cyber, if cyber becomes a tool that nation states use, or criminals can and non-state actors can use to cause disruption, I think civilians could be more affected. If things like, say you have one of these smart thermometers, smart thermostats in your house, and a terrorist organization decides to exploit a vulnerability in these and turn them all off in the middle of winter, and thereby not enabling people to have heating to their homes. I think that's an example where this greater dependence and integration of this technology into our own daily lives increases the vulnerability to these technologies being exploited by state and non-state actors. So the way to kind of prevent that dystopian view is to really pass regulations that mandate these IoT companies and other technology companies to design security into their systems and ensure that their firmware, their software, the hardware aren't just being fielded without a robust security design thinking going into the product, but are actually being fielded with a very conscious effort to make sure that design standards are applied to their products. If that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And that actually a topic which we've covered quite extensively, not only from the cyber warfare point of view, but just in general, because obviously if IoT things are vulnerable, that also makes it a very attractive target for hackers, not only for a scenario like you described where you turn off the heating in a house, but simply to use those devices as a device for a botnet or something. So
Right.
That's definitely something we're going to see. But coming back to more from the nation state point of view, is there something like a Geneva Convention in order? Is that something that maybe the UN or whoever should do?
It's complicated. there have been efforts. There have been a couple of efforts within the UN that are definitely stepping stones towards that kind of treaty for cyber. Um, One is a UN group of governmental experts. That's a Security Council and General Assembly-led initiative of select countries that are arguing about how the laws of war and apply to cyber. There's also some work going on in the first committee as well on cyber. The challenge is that you really have one track being led by the United States, another track being led by Russia, and all of the ideological components that you would expect from each being embedded in both of those processes. So diplomacy is important. You need to talk. The Geneva Convention wasn't made in a year. It was built on many stones and bricks of customary international law and smaller treaties. Treaties like the European Union Convention on Cybercrime is an example of a robust treaty that's international, both because it involves all the EU member states, plus the United States, Japan, Australia. But there has been resistance on adopting that as kind of this worldwide counter cybercrime treaty. Then there's also the role of the private sector, right? So Microsoft has two policy statements which declare the need for a Geneva Convention for cyber, but it doesn't really go far enough in terms of where Microsoft actually and other technology companies would have sway in. So it's very much focused on nation states should not use cyber weapons kind of talk, but Microsoft can't control national policies to use cyber weapons or not. What it can control is going back to that to the software design, is making sure that its software is fielded with as least amount of vulnerabilities, is identifying vulnerabilities, issuing patches, and then the private sector also implementing patches to these vulnerabilities very quickly to prevent their exploitation. So I think the private sector, kind of following the Microsoft model of having a digital Geneva Convention, might have the most impact right now in terms of decreasing the vulnerability landscape by having technical, design solutions to their products, so that and also very quick software patching and implementation measures in place as kind of a best practice within industry.
Okay.
That makes sense.
Absolutely. So yeah, I think that's most of the questions I had today. Very interesting, especially in the security industry, we usually tend to look at the private sector more than the nation state sector. But it's interesting what's developing there. So thank you, Professor Jana Koyorgos from New York University. And yeah, looking forward to speaking with you in the future. Maybe after the elections, there might be some interesting topic coming up.
I'm sure. Thanks for having me, Patrick. Appreciate the chance to speak to you and to your audience as well.
Thanks.